Today, the message, the title is Ezra's Example. Ezra's Example. Is it up there? And over there too? Right. There you go. And last week we gave a sermonette about learning about those who were thinking that they had it made. You know, they were convinced, brethren, people thought that they were going to be in God's kingdom. And Jesus gave us 7 examples, whether in Matthew or 1 in Luke, to show that eventually they ended up weeping and gnashing of teeth. And it was the idea that people have ideas of what they think they're eligible for success, and only to find out later that they're not, for some reason. Different people had different reasons for why they didn't succeed. But they were turned away from the kingdom of God in Jesus' examples and those messages. And there was a deep disappointment and anguish in them, and they came to realize that the opportunity they had slipped away. Well, that was that message on that hand. That was the negative side of his story. Today we want to look at a positive side of the story and look at someone who was the opposite of that, who was very successful, actually, and sought God and did what God wanted him to do. And we don't have necessarily the total outcome of his life, but from what it says and what we are given, you would think that he must have been a final success. And that is in the book of Ezra. Our brother Ezra is mentioned about. And we want to review about Ezra today and look at his life, his opposite attitude, and how he served God and wanted to do his will. And so if you'll turn to Ezra chapter 7, let's go into a couple of verses here. Ezra chapter 7. Ezra chapter 7 and verse 6. Ezra chapter 7 and verse 6. And it says, "This Ezra came up from Babylon, and he was a skilled scribe in the law of Moses, which the Lord God of Israel had given. The king granted him all his requests, according to the hand of the Lord his God upon him." You have to go back and review, how did Ezra even come to be here? Remember that the children of Israel, the children of Judah were taken captive to Babylon. And many of them were allowed to come back to that area from the king of Persia to reestablish the temple and so forth. But Ezra came from Babylon, a skilled scribe. And the king granted him his request according to the hand of the Lord his God upon him. We can see right away a completely different attitude in him. In verse 10, there's something here that we can learn from him. "For Ezra had prepared his heart to seek the law of the Lord and to do it, and to teach statutes and ordinances in Israel." This is a very important element for us, brethren. He has a completely different attitude of desire to teach, as opposed to holding it to himself. And those others in the other examples had excuses, reasons why they couldn't follow through. But in this case, we have an individual who's seeking God and wants to do his will and wants to be able to teach it. A lot of my message comes today from Haley's Bible Handbook. I got out my old Haley's Bible Handbook that I had on my shelf, and I prayed to ask God to help me prepare this message, and he gave me the thought, look in that old book and see what's in there. And Haley had a good rendition about Ezra, and he told about Ezra's example, and he tells about how he was a living example of Psalm 1 and Psalm 1, verse 1, 2, and 3. If you look at Psalm 1, for example, verses 1, 2, and 3. This is for us. We don't have it on the board. Do we? Oh, we guess we do. How about that? David, you're a miracle. Blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the ungodly, nor stands in the path of sinners, nor sits in the seat of the scornful. But his delight is in the law of the Lord, and in his law he meditates day and night. He shall be like a tree planted by the rivers of water, that brings forth its fruit in its season, whose leaf also shall not wither. Well, Ezra is an example of all these elements. He's seeking the law of God. He meditates day and night on it. He's planted and he grows and he prospers. And Haley pointed this out. He meditated on God's law day and night, prospered in what he sought to do for God. God's response was even to direct the heart of a king to carry out God's will. A second return to Jerusalem. Ezra would lead the return, and this is what God wanted. So Haley points out three elements that are very important for us to note. He came to teach the law of God. He came to teach the law of God. He came to beautify the temple. He came to restore the temple service. If you stop and think about these three elements, teach the law of God, beautify the temple, and restore the temple services. And guess what, brethren? This is a description of us. We're to learn to teach. Chuck Smith always tells us, learn what we can so we can teach it. You tell us that every time, virtually every time. Learn what we're learning so you can teach it. When we go through the book of Matthew, anything, we're learning the law of God. And what are we going to do in the world tomorrow? We're going to teach God's law. Finally, the world is going to understand about God's law. And who will teach it? God's people, God, the ones he's prepared to do this work. Beautify the temple. Imagine that. We're going to beautify the temple, but look at beyond that. Go to Ephesians chapter 2 and you'll see we are the temple. So he is beautifying the temple as we're sitting here, preparing the temple, teaching it how to learn the law and to be able to teach the law. And then to restore the temple services. The temple services would include the priesthood. And what are we going to be? A holy priesthood, brethren. That's what we're planning to be. God is preparing us for that. So Ezra then is an example for us. He's a type for us. We can follow. So let's go to Ezra chapter 10, verse 1. Ezra chapter 10 and verse 1. It says, "Now while Ezra was praying and while he was confessing, weeping, and bowing down before the house of God, a very large congregation of men, women, and children assembled to him from Israel. For the people wept very bitterly." And then go down to verse 6. Verse 6. You could do a Bible study by reading the whole thing, brethren. But verse 6, "Then Ezra rose up from before the house of God and went into the chamber of Jehohanan, the son of Eliashib. And when he came there, he ate no bread and drank no water, for he mourned because of the guilt of those from the captivity." The sin that was so huge for Judah at that time was the intermarriage that they were doing with the local women of the area. Intermarriage was idolatry, a form of the idolatry that was going on. Halley points out now that, interestingly, the very thing that led Judah to the captivity to Babylon to begin with was idolatry. It's one of the great sins that they were doing. And here they are returning to it again as they're coming back. They're still committing this idolatrous action. And so what does Ezra do? But my point today isn't so much the people, it's on Ezra right now. What did Ezra do? Ezra fasted and prayed in chapter 9, verse 5 and 6. Ezra 9:5. At the evening service, I arose from my fasting. He's fasting for the people. Do any of us, perhaps, and this is just a question, it's not like you shall, I don't mean it that way. I mean, do we think of ourselves to the degree, maybe fasting for things, fasting for the church, fasting for the country maybe. The country is in great trouble. But here he is fasting for these people. And here it says, I rose from my fasting, and having torn my garment and my robe, I fell on my knees and spread out my hands to the Lord my God, and said, O my God, I am too ashamed and humiliated to lift up my face to you, my God, for our iniquities have risen higher than our heads, and our guilt has grown up to the heavens. What is the weight of that, brethren, upon the man who feels the weight of his country on him? He's lifting up the whole country, like all the people, to God. Would you please help them? And what did Jesus Christ do? Lifted up everybody in his sacrifice so that we could be rescued and save the whole world. You know? Halley continued about the empathy of Ezra, that he confessed publicly the transgression and made confession as though he had done them himself, representing the people. What did Jesus take on? The sins of everybody. The sum total of all the sins ended up on Jesus. So certainly this was completely the opposite of thinking in the assuming he had it made attitude of those who wept and gnashed their teeth that we had last Sabbath. So turn it back on us, brethren. Put this back on us. I put it back on me. God is pleased with someone who turned to him, as we saw. Is God pleased with us? This is a question each of us has to ask ourselves. I can't judge you. I don't want to judge you. I'm having a hard time judging. I just want to be pleasing to God. What can I do? What am I lacking? Where am I falling short? Father, where am I falling short? Where do I mess up? Where am I succeeding? Where am I not? You know, we all have this question with God to help us prepare. We're in these latter days, brethren. It's getting tougher. We were just talking about the education system and how desperately terrible it is. The place is a rotten mess, brethren. And how is it ever going to get fixed? It has to be fixed. It must be. It's God's country. At least it was. I think he's taking it apart piece by piece. There's a verse that talks about that, but that's another subject. Anyway, so onward we go. Onward, Christian soldiers. We sang that hymn. Onward, Christian soldiers, marching as to war, with the word of Jesus going on before.